How's it, everyone? Today we are going to talk about safeguards. My name is Donald Mackay from XA International Trade Advisors. So about a week ago, the South African fastener manufacturers brought a safeguard application on steel hexagon-headed bolts. And this is the third fastener safeguard application in the last 2 years. In this particular case, they are looking for an additional 80% duty on top of the existing 30% duty that's already in place. I believe as COVID-19 bites and as our domestic producers come under more and more pressure, we're going to see an increased number of safeguard actions. And although I am a little bit concerned, particularly by the quantum being requested in cases such as this, but I think we're going to see more of these actions. It's a sensible kind of action to bring in times like COVID because safeguard duties have a limited shelf life. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time with a friend and colleague of mine, Gustav Brink, who truly is one of the world's top authorities on trade remedies, including safeguards. So we're going to understand exactly what a safeguard is, how it works, how it phases down. We're going to discuss the new proposal. This is a fairly technical discussion, but I think if you're a manufacturer or an importer, this is going to be an area that you really do need to familiarize yourself with. The proposed guidelines that ITAC have published are also interesting, and they would allow safeguards to be extended from the existing 3-year period all the way up to 10 years. So again, an important issue to get to grips with. Considerably more protection than is currently offered. But we have to also look and say, what are the impacts of imposing all of these high duties? What happens to our trade relationships? What happens to the inflationary impact of imposing such very, very big duties and removing competition out of the market? If I look at the fastener matter, the end result, if this process just simply keeps continuing, is that over a period of time, we may simply diminish the size of our fastener sector. We also have to deal with how these goods are rebated. There's somewhere in the order of around 10,000 different fastener varieties that are imported into South Africa. It'd be very difficult to be able to control rebates on all of these, and yet we know for sure that not all of them are made locally. This is fine when the duties are relatively modest, but as these duties move up to extremely high levels, what happens when the variety is no longer obtainable in the local market? And what happens even if it is obtainable, but it is not available in the kinds of volumes that you require for your particular application? And so I think we're faced with an interesting situation. These very large duties are going in, and I'm not entirely sure how the domestic industry is going to respond to the increase in demand that heads that way. But this is an evolving topic. Stick around to watch the interview with Gustav, and of course be sure as always to subscribe and ring the bell to stay up to date. And now we cross over to the interview with Gustav Brink. Hello, Gustav. How are you doing?
Fine, and you, Donald?
Yeah, all right. Definitely not as much fun in lockdown as advertised. Gustav, thank you for your time. I've already introduced who you are to the audience watching this, and today's conversation is about safeguards. So let me start off by asking you if you can just please explain what a safeguard is.
Okay, thanks, Donald. First of all, a safeguard is an emergency action that a country can take in cases where, for unforeseen developments, something that was not foreseen when they negotiated the tariff concessions in the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, something has now happened to result in a very significant increase in imports, and those imports cause serious injury to domestic industry that produces a product that we call a like or a directly competitive product.
So Gustav, for South Africa, in our particular example, we would have a bound rate, this upper limit that you can take duties on for the vast majority of our tariff book. So a safeguard would allow an increase in the duty beyond that bound rate. Now, when such an event occurs, so we see the surge in imports, for example, and the safeguard case kicks off. If it is found that a safeguard is warranted, how long can the safeguard currently be implemented for?
Okay, before I answer that, let's just go back to what you started to say when you introduced it. You can, when you have a safeguard, not only impose a duty that is higher than the bound rate, the maximum duty that you agreed with the WTO, you can also use one of two other measures. You can restrict the volume of imports through a quota, or you can use what is called a tariff quota, which means you have a certain volume within which products can come in either without an additional duty or with a small additional duty. And then outside of that quota, you have a higher duty. But in essence, yes, if we're talking about safeguard duties, because for instance, South Africa has never used quotas or tariff quotas, they've only imposed safeguard duties. That duty can be whatever is required to protect the domestic industry against the imports. So we've seen duties of 10%, we've seen duties of 50%, we've seen, at least at provisional level, duties as high as 160%.
Yeah. So when these, and let's maybe stay focused on the duties, because that seems to be the preferred way in South Africa to deal with safeguards. When the safeguard duty is imposed, at the moment, our safeguards tend to run their course in just under 3 years, so 2 years, 11 months. But with this new proposed guidelines that ITAC have published, they are looking to be able to extend that period. Do you just want to explain how it works at the moment, and then what is currently been proposed in the amended guidelines?
What we have to look at when we look at the safeguard measures is the duration. First of all, if a safeguard measure is imposed for a period of more than 1 year, you have to liberalize the measure regularly. Now, the agreement on safeguards of the WTO does not say what is meant by regularly. So that's open to countries, but certainly it means at least once a year. And that means that if you started with a safeguard measure, let's take one of the most recent ones, hot rolled coil or hot rolled steel. The duty originally imposed was 12%. After 1 year, it comes down to 10%, and then after another year, it goes down to 8%. So it has to come down every time. If, of course, you use a quota, then it would have to increase each year. The second major issue when we're looking at a timing point of view is that once you impose a safeguard measure for more than 3 years, you have to compensate your trade partners. Now, bear in mind that when we're looking at anti-dumping and countervailing, we're talking about what is called unfair trade. But when we're talking about safeguards, it's action against fair trade. So we're essentially saying that our domestic industry is not competitive under normal trading conditions, and they need a break, extra protection, to give them the opportunity to adjust so that at the end of the period, they can again compete against international imports. So let's take a situation where we have imports of around 4 billion rands. I'm going back to the hot rolled steel case because that's the latest case where measures were imposed. China represents about 60% of those imports. So let's just work with round figures, a margin of 2.4 million rands worth of goods imported in 1 year. That's before the safeguard was imposed.
2.4 billion, that is, yeah.
2.4 billion. So originally, ITAC imposed a measure of 12%. Now, let's say that at that stage, ITAC had to compensate China. It means that the value of compensation would be 12% times 2.4 billion rands, which is 288 million in duties. So effectively, what the two countries can then negotiate is that South Africa would provide China with, let's say, a 12% preference. So if the duty is 20% on a product, it would come down to 8% on 2.4 billion rands of their exports to South Africa on one or several other products. Or, of course, if we start with a duty of, let's say, 10%, we can take it down by 6%, but then it would have to be on 4.8 billion, etc. So the value of the duty at the end of the day has to be the same. And of course, it has to be products that are of interest to China. So it's not simply South Africa says, we will give you preferential access on these products. It has to be something China agrees to. If South Africa cannot agree with China on what those products should be, China can then unilaterally impose a similar measure on South African exports to China. So they can then impose an additional duty of 12% on 2.4 billion rands of our exports. And it can become very politicized, so they can decide exactly which products they want. Or if they're friendly, they can sit with us and decide which products will be of least importance to South Africa, where we would still be able to compete. But in essence, we have to maintain the same trade relationship that we had. It's just that we block certain products and we give either preferential access on others, or they block certain products on their side.
So, I mean, Gustav, you're saying we're in a position where either when we breach the 3 years, that is, once we're past that point, if there's an extension, we would either have to compensate, or if we can't get to agreement on compensation, they can retaliate. And of course, the retaliation is with whatever they choose it to be.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And
yeah,
bear in mind that at this stage, the hot rolled steel measure is down to 8%.
Yep.
Should ITAC in review decide to extend this measure, which it can do up to a maximum of 10 years, or the regulations actually say it can be extended by a maximum of 6 years. So theoretically, then it means a maximum of 9 years. The duty has to go further down from the current 8%. So let's assume for one moment that it started at 12, went down to 10, went down to 8, therefore it would now go down to 6%. We would now have to give China preferential access at 6% on 2.4 billion. And then, of course, a year later, it would go down to 4% and so forth.
Okay. So whatever we do, it can't, we can never, if ITAC were to review the safeguard duties on hot rolled steel, it would not be able to go back to the 12%, for example. It would have to keep reducing after, when we enter the new extended period.
Absolutely. That's an absolute WTO requirement. You have to continue liberalizing, and at the extension already, it cannot be higher than what it was at its lowest point before the extension.
Now, in this case, when ArcelorMittal made the application for the safeguard, one of the things they had to submit, I think it is within 60 days of initiation, is this adjustment plan. So what is the position if they request ITAC to extend this period, and let's just say they go for broke and they say we wanted to go on for the full 10 years. Is there a measure, some way that ITAC needs to look at what they had stated in their adjustment plan and say, look, what kind of progress have you made against this? And have you actually done anything? Or has the safeguard simply, served the purpose of making it attractive for ArcelorMittal shareholders, but they haven't really done anything to improve their competitiveness?
I'll go back one step. Another thing, if you impose a measure originally for more than 3 years, you have to have a half-term review. And at that half-term review, which is self-initiated by the authority, they have to consider whether the industry is adjusting or not. And if it's not, it has to immediately terminate that measure. Right. Even if the industry shows that they are adjusting, they have to look at whether the measure should be maintained and the schedule of liberalization should be maintained, or whether they can increase the pace of liberalization. Now we get to the end of the 3-year period and you have an extension review. The same principle would apply. That means that ITAC would have to investigate first and foremost whether the applicant has actually adjusted, or at least is still in the process of adjusting. So they will take the adjustment plan that was submitted, which obviously is a confidential document, and they will have a look at the steps that ArcelorMittal or whoever the applicant might be have indicated that they would be taking.
Yes.
And they'll say, well, there were 10 steps that you were going to take. How many of those steps have you taken? You indicated that it would take you 4 years to adjust. We're now on 3 years. Are you going to reach your plan within 4 years, implement it, or are you going to need more time? How much more time? Why are you not at 3/4 of your adjustment plan if it was planned for 4 years originally? So there would have to be a complete interrogation of the original adjustment plan, or theoretically, I think a company would be able to say, well, we started to implement that and that didn't work. So we have another adjustment plan, and this is what it is, and this is what we've done. But they can't simply sit back for 3 years, say, oh, we've had wonderful protection, because in some instances we've seen duties of as high as 50%, keeping all imports out of the market. Domestic industry has the whole market for itself and didn't do anything to adjust. Then simply there cannot be an extension at all. The other thing also, you mentioned if they want to extend the measure for the full additional 7 years. Well, bear in mind that if the measure is there for more than 3 years, you would have to review it again at the half-term mark. So if it is now extended by 7 years, after a maximum of 3.5 years, there would have to be another review, self-initiated by ITAC, to see whether the industry is actually adjusting.
Right. Now, Gustav, in terms of the adjustment plan, without belaboring this too much, the adjustment plan is really about the set of actions, in this case, that ArcelorMittal took. It's not related, for example, to the economic environment. In other words, if ArcelorMittal have not executed on their adjustment plan, but the economy has taken a hit, as it has right now because of COVID-19, would that not warrant the extension? In other words, even if they haven't done what they were supposed to do, but the environment now presents an existential threat to them, can they not get it extended on that basis?
It would be very difficult to do, because I don't think COVID-19 played a role if we specifically talk about the hot rolled steel, because it came essentially in the last quarter or maybe the last 6 months of the 3-year period.
Yeah.
Let's say that the measure was imposed and 6 months later we had COVID-19, which completely changed the market conditions. Clearly the adjustment plan that they had would not work, or at least high probability that it wouldn't work in the new environment. Again, it doesn't mean that they can sit back and do nothing. They would still have to show that they adjusted, maybe not following that exact adjustment plan, but they would still have had to be measures to adjust that industry. But in this particular case, we've had 2.5 years of the measure before COVID-19 became an issue in South Africa. So that could not have affected their situation. So certainly they should have applied at least 5/6 of that plan if it was planned for a period of 3 years.
Yep. Okay. Now, Gustav, when we look, and if anyone wants to take a look in Schedule 2 of the Customs Act, where we can see the safeguard duties. Now, I see there's a whole lot of countries that are exempted from the safeguard duties. So firstly, can you explain why a country would be on that exemption list? Maybe answer that question before I pose my next one.
Okay. First of all, it is one of the so-called special and differential treatment provisions in the WTO that is aimed at giving special treatment to developing countries. So you will not see the name of any developed country there, even if they hadn't exported anything to South Africa. So let's take hot rolled steel. Let's say the UK, which is a producer of hot rolled steel, did not export to South Africa during the investigation period. They would still be subject to the safeguard measure. Unfair, true, but those are the WTO rules. What you may find, however, is that there are roughly 200 countries in the world. I mean, there are 141 WTO members, 161 WTO members. All of them cannot export to South Africa. We're not such a big market. If you have a situation where a developing country exports less than 3% of the total volume imported into South Africa, and bear in mind that when I say South Africa, I actually mean the Southern African Customs Union, so it includes Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini. If they export less than 3% of what we import in SACU, then they are exempted from the safeguard measure. So let's take a country like Indonesia. Let's say Indonesia exported during the original investigation period 1% of South Africa's total imports of that particular product. Then they would have been exempted.
Right.
So no duties. However, what happens is you now have a list of probably about 140 countries that are exempted. But now a country like Indonesia says, well, there are now duties on this product against other countries. So the countries that would really be affected in this case would be China and Japan and Sweden and Germany and the UK and so on. So they see a gap in the market and they decide to start increasing their exports to South Africa to fill that gap. They're running a very real risk because the moment that their exports reach a level in excess of 3% of the original investigation period volume, they can automatically become subject to that safeguard duty. No new investigation is required. All that needs to be done is that the domestic industry has to alert ITAC to the fact that the 3% volume level has been reached. ITAC will verify with customs whether that is indeed the case, and if it is, they will make a recommendation to the Minister of Trade for the duty to be extended to also include Indonesia. Now, the reason I'm using Indonesia particularly is the very first investigation South Africa had relating to safeguards was on a product where, subsequent to the imposition of safeguards, Indonesia actually started exporting more product to South Africa on a product called lysine used in animal feed. And there you will find that there's a separate report issued by ITAC in which they then included the application of the safeguard duty to Indonesia as well.
Yeah. So, Gustav, I just want to clarify something. So if we look at the safeguard on hot rolled steel, there's, I don't know, 12, 15 tariff codes. So when we talk about the 3%, if we use your example of Indonesia, what if Indonesia is at 10% of one of those tariff codes, but at 2% of the aggregate of the 12 tariff codes? Do ITAC still get to increase the duty because they've breached it on the one tariff code?
That's a very pertinent question because you have different opinions on this. But from the WTO side, and there has specifically been jurisprudence on this, it said that once you define the product, you have to look at the overall situation of the product and not at each tariff heading specifically. So what ITAC did, if again we go back to the hot rolled steel, they imposed a single safeguard measure on all products on all those tariff headings. We don't have a duty of 12% on hot rolled coil, but 8% on sheets and 5% on something else. We had a duty of 12% on all hot rolled steel that came down to 10 and then to 8%.
Yes.
Using that, it means that if Indonesia is to become subject to the safeguard measure, it would have to be 3% of total imports of all of those tariff headings, and not only if it's more than 3% for one of those particular headings.
Now, that's clear. Thank you. Now, let's assume, back to the Indonesian example, let's assume Indonesia, that does happen, and it happens in the second year of the safeguard. Does Indonesia at that point only entering, being applicable, or the safeguard being applicable to it, does Indonesia then face a safeguard for 3 years, or do they just face it till when the safeguard runs its normal course?
No, the safeguard is imposed from the date that it is originally imposed. So it's effective from there. It has a maximum duration of, well, in this case, ITAC imposed for 2 years and 11 months, but so maximum overall duration of 10 years. It cannot be imposed for an additional period for countries that are subsequently joined, because it's not as though there's a new investigation. It's still part of the original investigation. You're simply expanding the scope of the measure. So the original date still counts as the starting date.
Right. Gustav, I don't think I have anything else to really say on safeguards. Do you have any other closing comments you'd like to make on safeguard measures?
Safeguards, one has to remember, is a very blunt instrument because it hits imports from all countries in the world. When you're looking at anti-dumping or countervailing, it's very targeted. So if there's a country that exports at low prices, unfair prices, you can target those particular exports. Yeah. What happened, for instance, in the very first investigation on lysine, you had lysine prices from China at roughly 6 rands per kilogram, from Indonesia at around 8 or 9 rands a kilogram, from Europe at about 10, and from the US at about 12. What ITAC then did was they imposed a duty of 27%, which then came down to 18 and then to 9. But the 27% was such that it took out all of the imports from the US, all of the imports from the EU. It sort of made the Indonesians just about competitive, but it wasn't nearly enough to stop the imports from China. So all that happened in that case is it gave the whole market away to China. And what happened after 3 years was that that industry simply closed down and we no longer have the industry. So clearly that safeguard was inappropriate. It didn't work. So when they look at a safeguard, I think it's very important that they very clearly determine what level of duties are required, and that they maybe not simply look at the imposition of a specific duty or an ad valorem duty, but probably something like a non-injurious price. So that if, for instance, in the lysine case, you could have said if the FOB value, or you could even have said if the CIF value, despite the fact that we work on an FOB value, but I mean, to transport something here from China as opposed to from the US, you have different freight rates. But if the landed price or if the CIF price is less than 11, then you pay the full difference in the duty. If it's more, you don't. Or perhaps to have proper consideration of using a quota. Now, of course, where you've had the situation like in hot rolled steel, you've already had a duty of 12%, it's now at 8%. You can't now change that because it means that you might actually increase the level. So you can't change that going forward. But if you have a new investigation of another product, that is something that I would seriously advise ITAC to look at very carefully, especially where you have different prices from different countries.
So you touch on a good point, Gustav. So there's also perhaps something else to think about, which is the hot rolled steel is a product that sits very far upstream. We also have some safeguards on some fasteners like set screws, which is a product that's quite far downstream. Now, there's quite a substantial economic difference in imposing a duty very far upstream versus on a consumer product, for example. So the implications of loading up the cost for everyone that's basically buying hot rolled steel, and hot rolled steel is probably the most basic steel product you get. So from there, if that cost gets elevated, it's going to make everyone downstream from there less competitive. And also with the lysine, which is a raw material. But we've also had safeguards on chips, as in like frozen potato chips. And like I said, we've now got on some fasteners, which are, I guess the fasteners are more intermediate products, not quite necessarily completely consumer products. But there's a substantial difference in taking those actions. And I would guess that COVID-19 is probably going to open the door to more safeguard actions. I would be quite concerned if those are clustered far upstream. So and also because, the further upstream you go, typically the more concentrated the industry becomes. So imposing a duty on ArcelorMittal as a monopoly producer has a very different effect to imposing a duty on a product that is competitive.
Absolutely. The thing is, of course, from a public interest point of view, if you have a duty on an upstream product, the effect on the consumer may be negligible. But on the downstream industry, it does pose a lot of problems because the general rule is that you should have a low duty on a raw material, a medium duty on an intermediate product, and a high duty on a final product. And now by having an investigation or a safeguard measure on something as basic as hot rolled steel, and the same would apply to something like cold rolled steel, you're now actually upsetting that whole flow, because now you have high protection on the primary product, which means that your downstream industry becomes uncompetitive, which now immediately opens up the gates to imports of fasteners coming in because they can no longer compete because of the safeguard on the upstream product. What is also important to note is that regardless of what happens in practice, if you look at the Customs Act, it specifically says that any of these Schedule 2 measures, which means anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguard duties, are not to be levied on products that are imported and used in products that are subsequently exported. So if you use hot rolled steel, you produce fasteners and you export those fasteners, then the safeguard duty should not be applied to those imported products.
Now that's interesting you mentioned that, Gustav, because ITAC published a memorandum a few years ago that actually said they will not issue the permits that allow you to either claim back the duties under drawback item 521. So this is where you pay the duty, you produce something, you export the thing you produced, and you claim back the duty afterwards, or through 47003 rebate stores, which really means you import the product, you don't pay the duty, and you then export your finished product. So although they haven't written this into their regulations or even in the form of a guideline, certainly they obviously wield the ability to refuse to issue the permit. And you can't actually lodge your claim, for example, with SARS or clear your goods into the 47003 rebate store without the permit from ITAC. So we've got the Customs Act saying that you shouldn't be levying such duties if the item is going to be exported, but you've got ITAC practically forcing you to buy local because they won't issue you with the permit. Although, of course, that is a memorandum and it isn't part, for example, of the ETA Act or the safeguard regulations, but it obviously does affect their behavior.
Well, clearly that action would be illegal because it's in violation of the Customs Act. Even if ITAC were to insert that into regulations, that would still be subordinate to the Customs Act. The only way for them to overcome that would be in future safeguard cases, because they can't do that retrospectively to existing measures, is to indicate when the measure is published that it would not benefit from these rebates and drawbacks. Otherwise, in terms of the Customs Act, they have to provide or approve any permit. So if any company is affected by that, they certainly would have recourse to judicial review, and the courts will simply force ITAC to then grant those permits.
So it's interesting, Gustav, because in the creation of the safeguard of a product so far upstream, ITAC have also then had to create a whole set of specific rebates in Schedule 4 to the Customs Act to allow the rebate of these duties. So ITAC pushed up the duties, the normal duties, to 10% on most steel products, primary steel products. And then on top of that, initially added a 12% safeguard, which is now at 8%. They've then inserted 80 rebates to allow the rebate of these duties. Some of those rebates allow the rebate of the full duty, both the normal and the safeguard duties. Others only the normal duties. But we've created an immense amount of complexity to be administered. So if you read some of those rebates, highly technical rebates, open to abuse, certainly we've had conversations with clients who are concerned because they have competitors who seem to be getting rebates that they're not entitled to, but really difficult rebates to manage because they are so technically complex. So it's anyone's idea when ITAC issue those permits, how on earth they figure out if the person does indeed qualify, and then from a SARS perspective, Bearing in mind that our inspection rate, if you take a port like Durban, at normal times is at around 1% at the moment, physical inspection rate. And these are not the kind of items that you can pick up with an X-ray scan as being compliant or non-compliant. So you can imagine kind of the problems that occur in doing this.
I can't comment on the inspection rate and how effective that is or not, because that would apply to any import. So it's not specific to products subject to safeguard.
Correct.
The problem is that the wider the scope of your safeguard investigation, when you're looking at something such as hot rolled steel, the more you're going to pick up problems. Bear in mind that in the late 1990s, 1999, the United States imposed a safeguard measure on steel. So not only hot rolled steel, but also cold rolled steel and several other products. It covered something like 83 or 87 different tariff headings. So very, very wide. And then you have a lot of these type of problems coming in, especially when you're looking at an economy like South Africa's. We're a relatively big economy. I mean, we're number 25 or 26 in the world. We're very diversified and small at the same time. But it also means that there are a lot of specific products that we do not produce. And now you have, again, this very blunt instrument that simply imposes a duty on imports from the whole world on the whole range of products. And then you find out that there are a myriad of products that we actually don't produce. And it doesn't make any sense to have safeguards on products that we don't produce. So now you have to have all of these cutouts. We've had the same thing in anti-dumping, for instance, on PVC-based roll goods, where we also had some like 10 or 15 exemptions eventually because of products that are not produced specifically in South Africa. In that sense, it sometimes makes sense to have more safeguard investigations, but separately on the different products. Then you can tailor make them. Looking just at one investigation that we have had in anti-dumping, for instance, on wire rope and cable, we had a very specific description that said products with a diameter not smaller than this and not bigger than that, and not with a plastic core and not with this type of twist. So you had a very long, it's something like a 4-line long description of what the product is that is actually subject to an investigation. But then it meant that afterwards you did not have to have 101 different cutouts. And it makes it much more administrable from a customs point of view.
Yeah, agreed. Gustav, thank you very much for your time. Stay safe. We'll speak soon.
Thanks, Donald.
Right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.